Welcome to Curious Life of a Childfree Woman, a podcast celebrating unconventional choices and asking curious questions through the lens of a happy, child-free life. Every week, I chat with experts on today's most interesting topics, inspiring us to think differently, live intentionally, and find fulfillment on our terms. Whether you're child-free or seeking a space where parenthood isn't part of the conversation, you are welcome here. It's not about comparison, it's about possibility. Let's get curious together. I find the tiny house movement fascinating. It is really hard for me to imagine streamlining my stuff enough to fit into a small space. But when I see other people do it, I'm really impressed by how creative and intentional they are with the way they live their lives. You can see that there's a special level of freedom when people step away from the default script that bigger is better to ask themselves, what do I really need to feel at home? This is exactly what today's guest, Laura Lynch, helps people explore. She's a certified financial planner and the founder of the Tiny House Advisor, where she works with the alternative living community to help people design lives that feel expansive, even if the square footage is small. I'm excited to talk about what draws people to this lifestyle, what they discover about themselves in the process, and what the rest of us can learn about enoughness from a movement that's rewriting the rules of home. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks, Emily. I'm super excited to talk about this. It is kind of in the ether. People are very curious, especially with rising housing costs and interest rates. So it's a good time to have this conversation.
Yes, I agree. I feel like I'm seeing this more and more from the YouTube videos that my husband puts on in the background to people who I know personally who are considering this. So I'm so glad you're here. And I want to start by understanding what drew you to the tiny house movement. You're a certified financial planner by trade. So tell me how these worlds collided for you.
Yeah, so it's a really intertwined journey. I've always done the conventional path. I've always followed the rules, as it were, got the degree and bought the houses and climbed the corporate ladder or what have you. And what happened was the pandemic changed so many of us in terms of our values. And so at the time of everything changing in 2020, I suddenly realized that my income was plummeting. I was a financial advisor at a different firm back then, and my income was tied to what was going on in the markets. The market in March of 2020 declined, crashed a good bit, and my income was tied to that. And I realized in that moment, my income is fragile, potentially. And yet, that mortgage that I had on that American dream house that I had, that, 2,000 square foot, $430,000 mortgage, your typical average home price, it doesn't change just because my situations change. And so we're living in a time where our labor market is shifting and the way that we make money is shifting. And more people are thinking about the risks of having a single employer, as an example, right? You've got that one person who makes or breaks your ability to pay your bills. And so we're all thinking about maybe diverse income streams or side gigs or what have you. And that is to create some financial resilience for ourselves. So back to the story, 2020, market crashing, income crashing, my mortgage staying the same. And so I'm like, why are we doing this thing where I feel so much pressure and a lot of stress and things are out of my control when we could be living in our tiny house where I'm sitting right now. We could be living there where we owe nobody nothing, to use a double negative, and where we just feel more, content and safe and resilient. And so we just executed a 30-month project plan from there and had to sell off of our real estate and change our businesses and move into our tiny house. It took a good bit of time to get all of that taken care of, but it was a major shift to allow us to align with our values in terms of financial resilience, to frankly add a good bit of home equity into a place where I could tap it in order to launch a new business and, to boost up our retirement savings and all those things. And so the two things are very much intertwined. Launching my business to focus on this community was in alignment with my lifestyle. Both things enabled each other. It was just sort of, I don't know, magic.
I love that you have launched a business that is in close relationship to the way you're living your life now. And I've never heard somebody say through that pandemic time, so many of us were recalibrating our values. I think we talk about the pandemic and how there were, of course, huge economic shifts and shifts in certain industries, and a lot of people were furloughed. And, so much happened to so many of us that changed things and kind of put us on a different trajectory. But I think that recalibration of our values, I never hear it phrased that way, but that's sort of what happened almost as a symptom of some of those things we didn't expect in the market and with our jobs, things that were secure, at least we thought they were secure before that pandemic hit. So I'm so impressed that you not only realized this about yourself, but then took action, put this into reality to downsize from, like you said, the average kind of American dream home and shifted your life. How big is your tiny home? Like, what did you shift into?
Yeah. And I should say that it wasn't so far out of our realm of possibility because the tiny house already existed for us. So there was that. It's not like I had to go and build a tiny house during that same process. We had already done that step. And so I think that's where I've really found a place where people have a need. If you are trying to go in some downsized direction, getting from a traditional home into something smaller, if it's in a direction that's in the alternative living space, like a tiny home, there is a lot there that has to be figured out. And so we were fortunate in that we have the tiny house already. But for those folks that don't have it, that's why I created the business, is to help people make that transition. So we built this tiny house in 2016 and 2017. Basically, we bought some land out west. I had lived out west in the past when I was in the Air Force. And so I had lived in Nevada and I love the West. So in 2015, we bought some land here. And so then we were like, well, what are we going to do with the land? Because we didn't have time. I was in corporate. I had 2 weeks off a year. You don't have time to build a house in that amount of time. So we built a house on a trailer, which is what a tiny house often is, in our backyard. We were in Florida at the time. And then in 2017, after a year of Saturdays building it in our backyard, we towed it across the country, and I'd had some infrastructure built in our absence, and we put the tiny house here and we came and visited, for all the subsequent years until 2020, when I'm like, we got to go there full time. So that is kind of how it played out. I'm not sure if I answered your question or.
No, that's great. I don't even know if I asked you a question. I'm impressed. Oh, how big is the house? Like, what is a tiny house?
So the definition of tiny houses is really changing. Right now, most people would consider a tiny house 399 square foot or less. And that has to do with a lot of the legalization and rules around tiny homes. That's why that definition exists. But, in my book, tiny is more about alignment with what you need and what is important to you. And so we've been kind of sold this idea that everybody needs a 2 or 3 or 20,000 square foot home, but most people use some percentage of their square footage. So in my 2,000 square foot house that we moved out of last year, there were huge rooms that we never really went into, right? We were just paying to air condition them, and we were paying for all the square footage that we didn't really use properly. So in my book, tiny is really about optimizing for the spaces that you use. Right now, our living space is 300 about square feet. We built it to be the legal size that we could tow down the road without a permit. But I'm in the works to create a studio greenhouse space for more room to work in because I'm sitting in my loft right now. And my husband has a very large shop because he works for a living in the trades. And so he has a lot of tools and equipment. So, though our kitchen and bedroom and living room is quite small, we have other spaces. And so I love that about tiny living, is that if you spend less on the place that you sleep and maybe where you cook, and you expand your maybe entertainment space outside, and maybe you have sort of a separate place where you work from, or whatever, that you can just be more creative and optimize for how your lifestyle really is, rather than having a bunch of bedrooms that you just fill up with stuff that shows up that you haven't yet opened.
It's so real. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, yeah, there's definitely some space or some closet or something that I don't really use. And it just seems weird to get rid of it. But then when you really think about it, it's like, why? It's not doing anything as it is. And I like what you said there. I keep thinking about Barbie dream houses and how we're really conditioned from such a young age when we think about it to want something that's really big, like more is more. And the goal is seemingly to start in a place that you can afford, but as you can afford more, you continually upgrade. You move from an apartment to a home, then you move from your first home to a second home, and you're just getting bigger and bigger. And we see all of these aspirational characters in mansions and movies. And again, like our toys, if you played with Barbie growing up, she had multiple dream homes and that was fabulous. And then she could house all this furniture and all these clothes. And it felt like something you wanted. But you touched on creativity there. And I think that's such a cool piece of this. Like, almost by necessity, you have to think differently about the way you use your space. And when I think about when I lived in an apartment or friends I know who have apartments in Manhattan, not a very cost effective place to live, but because you probably have a very small living space, limited by finances, and I was limited by finances when I had a little apartment, I did so much more outside of my home. I was out in the city more often or out doing work or something in a park. Like you utilize so much more of the place that you live when you just don't have that option within your physical dwelling. So tell us some of the creative stuff that you do or that you've seen your clients do when it comes to kind of living alternatively.
Yeah. I'm in a place we now live in the Southwest, and so we have a climate that's quite conducive for being outdoors a lot. And that is one of the reasons why I live where I live. And so we have a deck that we built, like, immediately after getting the tiny house parked here and settled in, we were building a deck, and we spend a lot of time out there on the deck. Like I said, we're working on a studio space, which is an Adobe building, so I'm really fascinated with alternative building methods and green building methods, and I just wanna live in the earth, basically. That's the way it goes. So we're gonna build this Adobe greenhouse space, which is gonna be passive solar, meaning not a photovoltaic, but instead capturing the warmth of the sun and distributing that in the space for the heat through thermal mass and water recycling and that sort of thing. Because I work in my home, so I spend a lot of time indoors in front of my computer, like lots of people do. But when we are having free time, like it's a lot more hiking, it's a lot more time on the deck, having dinner parties outside on an old table with friends, going to the farmer's market. I think that those folks that are in tiny and alternative living are very community minded. And so they'll tend to lean into the resources and activities and things within their community. And I love that about kind of stepping away from the suburbia model of the single family home that's very isolating. Everybody goes in their garages and they push the button and they separate themselves from the world. This has made us very lonely, frankly. All of us are aware of this loneliness epidemic that we're experiencing. And so having a smaller living space means that you got to be in closer proximity with others, including your family members, and, kind of get back into that village mindset that we actually, as humans, did historically, right? We lived in community. We raised our children in community. We shared resources. We helped each other out. We did rain dances together, right? These are the beautiful ways that humans have existed in the past. And we've really been sold on this idea that we have this, separation and everybody else is dangerous. And so we're going to go in and close our gates on our communities. But that creates some of the problems that we see in our society now with inability to communicate with others and discuss difficult topics and interpersonal issues and things. And so, if we can move back to smaller living spaces, then maybe we can harken back to the root of who we are as people and be more connected and be closer to the earth and spend more time in nature.
Oh my gosh, you just highlighted so many benefits of this movement that I hadn't really thought of before. And I did want to ask you about the community piece. And of course, we're making generalizations, but if what you've seen, if it is more of a desire to be in community, or if it's more of a desire to kind of have this like private retreat and be more isolated in your tiny home. But it sounds like there's more of a mindset of kind of building a village more than building an escape.
Yeah. I'm sure that it's not just my algorithmic feed on social media that shows a lot of people talking about buying land together and putting a bunch of small living spaces and growing a garden together and sharing resources. So I would say, generally speaking, people that are headed down this path of tiny living, and of course, let's just define it a little bit, right? There are supposedly 3 million people in van life, right? Whether that's full or part time. I'm in the Southwest, like I said. Everywhere I go, I see fully built out Sprinter vans and other types of vans where people are living their life in a nomadic way. There's the schoolie movement, people building out buses, doing the same thing as van life, moving around. Tiny homes are typically more fixed and they, span the range of like an ADU in a metro urban area where housing is really expensive. California has been very forward thinking in terms of allowing tiny homes as ADUs in backyards to expand housing opportunities. Where I am, I'm on rural land, so it looks a little bit more isolationist, but this community is very tight knit. We have a great newspaper here that tells us all the activities, and we, go to our local events and we participate in the community more than we ever did before. So I would say people, generally speaking, that are looking at this lifestyle are trying to do it to be closer and more connected than the alternative.
We've talked about the community, and you sort of touched on the sustainability benefits of this with some of the green building materials. What do you think is the core root of this movement taking off? Is it both of those things? Is it finance? Like, what are the core motivations that are driving people to consider tiny homes, van life, all of this different alternative living?
Yeah, I think that there's a shift of values that has happened in a certain subset of the population away from stuff into experiences. And I think we saw this a lot with the pandemic, right? People, all of a sudden, everybody was buying an RV and going out and traveling to all the national parks with their kids, right? And so now to get into national parks, there's like a lottery, right? You got to have the right license plate number now to get into national parks. So I think we've moved away from some of the things bring me happiness to the experiences bring me happiness. And so that's really fueled people getting in their vans or RVs or what have you and traveling and spending more time experiencing, the beautiful country or traveling around the globe. So that's been a key part of the movement. Sustainability is, I think, at the heart of why people are trying to live in smaller spaces because we all realize that there is a lot of cost to us and maybe to the earth to continue to expand our footprints. And so as people are thinking about how can I just be more efficient and how can I use fewer resources, then having a smaller home is obviously going to use fewer resources because you have less to cool, you have less to heat, and you can sort of manage some of the other pieces of consumption there. So, people that are generally in tiny or alternative living are eco minded, I would say. Here in New Mexico, where I am, we have a lot of folks that build out what are called earth ships, which are self contained homes that create all their own. They collect their own water, they create their own energy. They're like fully self contained homes that do not draw on any other resources other than what they can create themselves, which is really fascinating. So, yeah, I think the sustainability part is really important. The community part is really important, but you don't have a conversation about tiny living without talking about the finances because everybody who thinks about this thinks about how can I create some extra financial security for myself by having less cost of home. It is just the most basic calculation. If you look at your budget, the largest line item you have is your housing. And so that's the largest impact that you can make. And I often say we can make more financial gains or impact for ourselves by thinking about how we make our life decisions than by saving an extra 2% in our 401k, right? The amount of money that I was able to capture out of my home equity and put aside for rainy day was more than I was ever going to be able to do just by trying to squirrel away those little bits of our 401k. And we have this weird cognitive dissonance where if you Google, how can I save money? It's going to tell you to stop going to Starbucks and stop buying your lattes. When the reality is that the largest line item is your housing and you have choice about the cost of your housing to some degree. It is really challenging right now based on what's being built and what's available. out there. But there's other hacks beyond moving into 300 square foot like I did, like co-housing. I've been talking about this almost to everybody. If the real estate that's available in the market is large and expensive, buy with somebody else, right? Get a couple of families together where you can share resources and help, take care of each other if the house that's available is large and would suit two families living there. So there are all kinds of different creative ways to think about housing right now that will allow us to create more gains and more savings for ourselves than we ever will be able to by just pulling our latte pennies together.
It's so true, and I feel like this really is opening my mind because we don't think of this. Yes, I look at my budget and the mortgage is my biggest expense, of course, but I approach that like, well, it's a mortgage. I can't not have a mortgage. So I just have to deal with it, and then figure out how to try to save and whatever with whatever money is left over. And that is not true in reality. Like, there's so many other ways to do this. And I love that you've shared a lot of different options here. Yes, tiny homes, but all these other creative things that people are doing. Knowing what we know about the housing market, interest rates, the inventory shortage, do you see this continuing? What do you see in the future?
Yeah, well, none of us have a crystal ball, right? But it doesn't seem like housing prices based on the inventory shortage that we do have is going anywhere anytime soon in terms of price decreases. Interest rates may come down, but still, right now you have to make almost $120,000 in national average in order to afford the current average home price because of so much interest that's spent, right? And so I talk about this a lot too, that, when you have 6% interest, as an example, and you buy a $430,000 home, you are going to spend double that amount by the time you get through the mortgage, right? Another $460,000 on interest. That is not home equity. Interest is not home equity. It is just paying someone to use their money to put a roof over your head. And so you don't get that back. And it doesn't go into a bucket someday that you can cash out either. It's just paying someone to use their money. And you can't sell off your fourth bedroom to cash out a little money when you have a job loss or you have a medical emergency, right? It's all like all of your eggs are in that really big basket. And we've been sold on this idea that mortgages are good debt and that home equity is really, really important. But the reality is it's inflexible. You can't get at your home equity without paying more fees and interest. So it doesn't matter if you take a home equity line of credit, if you take a home equity loan, if you refinance to get out home equity, the only way that you get your home equity out without paying more interest and fees is to sell your home and downsize. That's the only way to cash it out without paying more interest and fees. And so we just forget how much of our energy, our human capital, our attention, our life is spent paying for the roof over our head. And so I think the more that people like start to critically think about, hey, how much of myself am I giving just to have this 3,000 square foot roof over my head? Would I rather focus my energy on something else that I'm more passionate about or that interests me more or create some sort of impact in the world that I want? And how do I get to spend my life doing something that's more impactful than just paying for this roof for 30 years and then paying for it some more because I have to keep updating it and repairing it and all of that? And so if we can just take care of the housing part, right? If we can downsize, spend less on our house, take care of the housing part, then we can figure out what is true to me and what is it that I am trying to do while I'm on this one wild and precious life, as Glennon Doyle says. And what is it that I want to do here? And, how can I focus my efforts and energy towards something that's actually impactful?
Do you think people who are living this alternative lifestyle and making those changes, minimizing these pieces that can bring so much pressure to our lives, do you think those people are happier than those of us living the more traditional path?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of thoughts and focus on happiness. I've thought about happiness a lot in the last few days, just because wherever we go, there we are. As that book title says, right? It's a mental and emotional journey that we take. But I think that most people are walking around with a lot of stress related to income coming in. expenses going out, and how do I continue to manage that? I mean, a lot of the country can't afford the average home right now. People are working multiple jobs. People are concerned about their employment, situation right now, especially white collar workers are having challenges with employment. A lot of college students graduating that can't find that starter career because AI is taking over some of those jobs. And so the more that we can figure out, hey, life is complex and challenging and it causes a lot of stress. So, what is it that I can simplify in my life in order to expand my capacity to deal with those complexities and stress? And so, I am in a position where we have become debt free and mortgage free last year. And this allows me to deal with all of the other complexities of running a business and managing income streams and saving for my future and frankly keeping up with my passwords, right? And I have more capacity for those things now because the house thing is checked and that's done.
You and I are both child free. That's actually how we initially got connected. And I'm sure that through your work with this, you serve a large variety of people. Do you see more child free people going this direction and exploring different alternative living options?
Yeah. So the people in tiny living fall into three sort of, demographic buckets from an age perspective. There's the young people who this is a starter home opportunity. Though, just as an aside, the money part of that is complicated because there aren't yet tiny home mortgages. So figuring out the money part of having a tiny house as a first home requires a little bit of work. It's not as easy as walking into a subdivision and meeting with a builder representative and signing on the dotted line. So, young people, people retiring, people that are downsizing and retiring, and then the middle-aged people like me that are using this as sort of an opportunity to Gen X, which I'm a member of Gen X, has not saved enough for retirement. And so downsizing, figuring out what is a career transition. A lot of folks in my age group are considering consulting or solopreneur or whatever opportunities. This is my story in terms of creating some runway for leaving a corporate life and starting something on your own. Tiny homes are, of course, not ideal for large families. And so, for those folks who have chosen not to have children or not chosen, maybe by circumstance or whatever the reason is, like me, this makes a lot of sense, right? We're just housing two people, two busy people who are out living their best lives. So, we don't really need to have a big, giant house to take care of.
I love that. Outliving your best lives. And that's exactly right. Like it's about all the places that we want to be and the people we want to spend time with. And so much of that happens outside of the walls of our home, no matter how big your house is. So why not take advantage of all these savings? And I have to say, well, congrats on being like mortgage free, debt free. And it does feel so dreamy to think that I could just be like, oh, there are no more house payments. That's pretty incredible. So I love all of the upside that you've shared with us. Part of my challenge in even approaching this topic is the mindset shift because we have been so conditioned to think, I need a big closet, we need a guest room, we need all these things that are in a traditional American home, or at least how we picture it. What are some of the challenges or mindset shifts that come up for people you need to sort through if you're serious about making this kind of change?
Yeah. We all face hard things in life and we have to pick our hard. And for sure, there are things that are challenging for us. We do, for some reason, have a lot of guests. A lot of people want to come visit us. And so, right now, when people come to visit us, they're staying in our camper. We kind of have to shuffle around, or we have friends in the area with Airbnbs. So, you have to figure that out. In the meantime, we're working on that additional space that'll have some guest space in it. So, visitors, I have historically loved to have big dinner parties. If I'm going to have big dinner parties now, right, I got to have them probably outside, which can be a good thing, right, in the right climate or weather. I don't yet have a dishwasher
That's not trivial. That's serious.
because my clothes washer is in the spot of my dishwasher. And so I wash dishes way too much. And so that's a thing. But kind of on a big picture perspective, folks that want to make that shift, you have to go from what is maybe conventionally easy in terms of hey, if I'm going to move across town or whatever, I'm going to hire a realtor and I'm going to go search for houses and I'm going to check all these boxes and I'm going to make an offer and I'm going to figure out my financing. Like it's hard, but we know what that hard looks like. But for folks that are thinking about an alternative path, it's not paved. And so you have to be a little bit more gritty and you have to do a little bit more research and you might have to not take no for an answer. And it's just a little bit more complicated just because there's less volume of folks that are going this way. And so it's just not as clear. So the legalization on tiny homes in particular is a municipality by municipality thing. So city, county, state, every different jurisdiction has different rules. So I volunteer with the Tiny Home Industry Association, tinyhomeindustry.association.org. There's a resource map there where I try to collect and curate all of the legalization efforts that are happening. There's a lot of grassroots movement there, people that are going out and finding plots of land and working with their municipality to develop tiny home communities. People like me who bought rural land that isn't as regulated and put my tiny home on it. There's ways to do it. It's just not as clear. And folks that are taking up van life or schoolies, right? They have to figure out where they're going to park all the time and how they're going to travel and what their travel costs are. And that looks different than what is my electric, water, garbage, mortgage bill, right? It's a different thing. So it's just a matter of kind of what hard do you want in your life? Are you willing to deal with a little bit of ambiguity when figuring out the legalization of where you're going to live your life versus having to pay $4,000 a month like I was doing for the next 30 years?
Yes, that's a good way to think about it. Like you have to choose your hard. And I'm sure there are people listening, like when I hear you say, oh, if you're going to take this path, the road is unpaved, that sparks my interest. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, something unconventional, less traditional. Like I want to learn about that. So I'm sure there are people listening who feel the same way. And it's amazing that you have the business you do to help with some of those logistics, legalese, the financial piece of this. There's clearly a lot more to figure out than I would have assumed. So I think it's so smart that you are in service of that community. I also wonder if there's an identity piece that comes up with this. I think often we rely on our house, even if we don't host all the time and we're not always filling it with people, it can kind of be part of who we are or making us feel like we've made it, quote unquote, when you have this big shiny house, even if behind the scenes you're losing sleep at night because how are you going to pay for it? Or you need a new roof and now that's a big expense, whatever. I think that's the reality for a lot of people. How have you experienced that? Or what do you see in other people? Kind of that self identity of like, what is enough?
I love that. What is enough? Because all the screens all the time will tell us we never have enough. And it doesn't matter, like you said, if you get a starter home or if you've got a mid career home or if you've got a retirement home, there's always something better out there, always something bigger out there. And there's always more stuff to acquire. And there's always better luxury items, right? And so, what is enough? I think that's a very individual decision. And for some people, to your point, like having that beautiful home is the number one most important to them. And good, do that thing, right? If that is what is truest and deepest to you, then do that thing. But if what is truest and deepest to you is, hey, I want to be able to spend more time with my family and less time at the office, or I want to be able to launch this creative solution that I've had on the back burner for a long time and be able to invest in myself, or I want to be able to spend half of my time hiking or whatever it is, then look at your house and determine if that is more or less important than those other things. And then figure out what is enough in that area that's less important and root into that and try to focus on optimizing your life for your values. Whenever I work with clients, the first thing we do is a values worksheet. Let's figure out what are your 2 or 3 core values so that we can use that as a guardrail for all life decisions. Because if you're suddenly chasing a materialistic view and yet you've told me that simplicity is one of your values, then let's just ask the question, is that in alignment with your true self, or is that in alignment with a version of yourself that someone has handed to you and you're sort of pressuring yourself to follow that? A lot of times folks that are doing some sort of alternative housing, they grew up camping as an example and being outside and being in a smaller space and where they got to spend more time out in nature. I grew up camping a lot with my family and realizing exactly what you do actually need. Folks that backpack a lot know exactly what they do need and what they don't actually need. And so I think that there is an opportunity for all of us to really think about what is it that really is deeply important to me? What gives me significant pleasure? And let me focus my life on that because we can't have all the things. I'm sorry. I know we've been told we can have all the things, right? We can have the career and the big house and whatever it is that we think is important. But we live in a world where you have to prioritize and you have to focus on what is actually most important to you. And so having that identity of, I know what's important to me and I'm going to focus my life around what's important to me. And by the way, I like to be a little bit rebellious and not conform to what the world tells me, which of course your audience is in that camp of a little bit of rebellion there. I think that can just really spur you. And then you can really root into that. Hey, I'm different and I think differently and I live differently and I do it because I know what's important to me. I think that can just sink into you and then you just live into that.
I love that answer. So much self awareness and really living based on our own values, not what society tells us to value, which in many cases is easier said than done. But I think conversations like this can open the door to thinking a little bit more critically about the choices that we're making. I love the immersion in nature that this can bring, and I know that's a really important thing. Like, there's so much data. I wanna have a whole conversation about this, the data around what happens to our house when we're in nature. But those of us who love to live in an urban environment, I love living in downtown Chicago. What's going on with alternative living in cities? And you kind of mentioned that this might be city by city, but what kind of creative solutions have you seen for people who want that lifestyle?
Yeah, so there's some really good examples of places in urban areas where sort of lots that weren't when they planned the community, right? There are lots that didn't serve the purposes that they were zoned for or that are empty or whatever. And so pocket neighborhoods are popping up in cities all over the country where a small lot is being used to put a couple of tiny homes on it that's creating a little pocket community there. Obviously, in large cities, right, people are living in all kinds of small apartment options. That's all the same, right? If you're living in a more way that's optimized for the life that you wanna have and you I had a great author on my podcast a long time ago. She lived in 90 square feet in New York, and she just spent a lot of time outside and in her community doing other things, and she had a loft bed, and she worked below, and that worked for her. She was working on a book, and she needed to minimize her cost of living in order to get that thing out into the world, and so she used that for a time for that purpose. So I think that density in urban areas is always being discussed in terms of smaller studio or small living spaces, pocket neighborhoods in the tiny living space. You know, folks are living in, of course, their vans, traveling around from place to place. And so I think there's a lot going on in the thinking small because we need to think smaller in order to be more sustainable and in order to create more density and to use the resources that we do already have. But those are just a couple of examples.
I love it. I need a little pocket neighborhood in my neighborhood. I think that's so cool. I feel like there's just so much purpose behind this. Even what you said with that author, like she clearly, at least in that season, was valuing getting that project out into the world, like having capacity to pursue that creative effort. I would love to know whether everybody listening is interested in pursuing this for themselves or not. I feel like this could be a really beautiful ripple effect in the culture of, again, thinking about our value system, thinking about purpose, kind of questioning maybe the American dream that we have all been sold. How do you see the impact of alternative living on society as a whole?
Yeah, I hope that as more and more people are thinking about connecting with each other, connecting with their community, connecting with the earth, being outside, having more family time, because we kind of get into this mindset that the way that we provide for our family is a very large home. And then a lot of folks are in the office and spending a lot of time working on their career and not with their family. So, the human to human connection and the way that we can go back to the way that we used to share resources, that we used to care for each other, especially as we are facing a really growing crisis of care for folks as they get older. You know, the 401k, as an example, wasn't even invented until the year that I was born. If you go back in time, we took care of our family members in our family. And right now we have this crisis with what's going on with Medicaid cuts to those that are going to need care later on in life. We've got people that can't afford, most people cannot afford long term care. And so, the more that we can start to create these multi generational communities of people that can both share their lifelong expertise and share some care and grow some food together or share some other resources, I think that we'll all just be so much happier because we'll have those connections that we've lost by driving into our gated communities and pressing the button. And so, obviously, we're not going to change everybody's mindset and we're not going to, turn the country into a bunch of little villages where people actually care about their neighbors and feel connected to their community. But I think that there are certain people out there that are already leaning in this direction, already feeling that isolation and the way that we kind of churn and churn and churn and we do the things we're supposed to do and then we feel a little miserable. And so, like, how can we not feel miserable and how can we reconnect with all the things that feed us and fuel us? And how can we give back? And so, living small or thinking smaller is one way to bring all that together.
It's such a smart solution. And I think what we typically do is so counterintuitive, even the way you just described that. We think that we want to have this big house, whether it's just us and a partner, whatever the family unit looks like. Then you end up spending a lot of time out of the home to provide that house. And even when you're all in the home, you're in different rooms because you have a whole house with multiple TVs and everybody kind of separates and does their own thing. And the whole point in the first place was to have this space for you to be with the people that you love. So, yes, I'm just continually fascinated by everything that you're sharing. For people who are listening and also fascinated and maybe have no clue how to get started, if you do want to learn more about alternative living or maybe even explore what it could look like in your own life, what do you suggest is the best first step for people?
To experience it. So there's lots of Airbnbs out there of smaller living spaces, more alternative living options. Hip Camp is another place where you can find these. You can go to festivals. There's Tiny House and Van Life and Schoolie festivals all around the country. So seeing it in person, staying for a period of time. Can you live in a smaller space for a period of time? That will give you a sense for whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you. So that would be a first step, is to try to go and experience it for yourself. And then there's a lot of resources. There's a ton of content on YouTube of people that have built their own homes or are living in tiny homes. I was featured on the Tiny Home Tours channel, which is a really big YouTube channel. So you can see all kinds of examples of small living spaces on that channel. Lots of different social media options to experience, Facebook groups, all of that. So just start getting into it and try to experience it in person because that'll be the only way you'll know if it's going to feel good for you.
Solid advice. Laura, thank you so much for coming and sharing all of this. Before we conclude, for everyone who wants to meet you or connect with you further, tell the people what you have going on and the best place to find you.
Yeah, so I have a podcast too. It's Less House, More Moolah podcast. So I feature people that are in the tiny and alternative living space, whether they're living it or whether they're professionals working in it. So you can check that out. And all of that can be found on my website, thetinyhouseadvisor.com. And I spell advisor like advisor, Adviser.
Perfect. We will make sure all of that is linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing your lifestyle and your expertise. I find it so inspiring, and I know others will too.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you for listening. Now I want to hear what you learned. DM me on Instagram at Curious Life of a Child-Free Woman or leave a review with your top takeaway. These ratings really do make a difference. If you're not a member of the Curious Life Club yet, you are invited. Visit CuriousLifeOfAChildFreeWoman.com to join the conversation, share suggestions, and be first to know the next curious topic. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next week.